Here are the most epic origin stories in history. It's the year 304 BC and the Moran Empire is welcoming a new royal child. Lovingly held by his mother, he's given the name Ashoka. The emperor, a man named Bindusara, stands near and gazes at this newborn. In this son, he sees a future of, not much really. See, the emperor already has another son named Sushima, born from another one of his wives, and he's actually his choice to become his heir. To add to this, Ashoka's mom was a commoner. Whoops! I mean, how did that happen? Well, Sushima was a noble, so yeah, case closed here, but Ashoka is still a royal son and he's given a royal upbringing. Time passes, Ashoka grows up, and boy, he does look like he's turning out to be a huge disappointment. He's short, kind of fat, and is suffering some sort of weird skin condition which grosses his father out. Though he had already made up his mind that Sushima was his guy, now he's certain Ashoka is just way too ugly to be emperor. I mean, come on, look at him. But what Ashoka lacked in looks, he made up for in charisma and intelligence. And like most kids who know they're not the favorite, he grows to have a huge chip on his shoulder. He's schooled in all the things a royal son should learn, and once he's of age, his father begins to send him out to govern parts of his kingdom and to quell rebellions. Ashoka's first assignment was to govern the area of Uan, where he proved to be a master of governmental policy. And later he was put in charge of quelling rebellions in Taxila, where he demonstrates a natural ability to command a military. It becomes obvious that Ashoka is talented enough to rule the empire, and this doesn't go unnoticed by the emperor's ministers. They try to tell the emperor, but their opinions don't really matter because Bindusara had already made up his mind. Sushima was to be his heir. But in 273 BCE, the emperor falls ill and is quickly on his deathbed. Sushima is off fighting a rebellion, so he sends for him to return home quickly so he can be crowned emperor. But by this point in time, the ministers have decided they like Ashoka way better. They think Sushima is a spoiled brat and they've watched Ashoka kill it both governing and on the battlefield. So they lie to the emperor and say that Ashoka's sick and can't go, and that maybe he should just make Ashoka the emperor temporarily while he's waiting for Sushima to return. The emperor is like, "Did I stutter?" At which point legend says Ashoka proclaims, "If the throne is rightfully mine, the gods will crown me as the next emperor." And just like that, Bindusara dies instantly and Ashoka is made emperor. How convenient. When Sushima returns back to the capital, he's led by the ministers into a trap and falls into a pit of charcoal and dies an agonizing death. Ashoka then goes off and kills every single one of his other brothers, except one he kind of liked to ensure he would have no competition. And so in 268 BCE, Ashoka is crowned emperor. He quickly proves all of his father's ministers were completely wrong and becomes an unhinged tyrant who rules with fear and terror. His atrocities are too many to list, but here are some of his greatest hits. He once gave his ministers the impossible task to cut down every flowering or fruiting tree, and when they failed, he chopped off all their heads himself. Oh my God, we should have totally gone with Sushima. This other time, while walking through a park with his concubines, he sees a beautiful Ashoka tree, which puts him in the mood for some afternoon delight. The concubines are so grossed out having to touch his gross skin that as soon as Ashoka fell asleep, they go and chop all the flowers off the tree to make sure it won't happen again, which I find hilarious. But when Ashoka wakes up and finds out what they did, he has them all burned to death. And perhaps as piece de resistance, he constructed a beautiful palace which he then fills with the most evil torture devices imaginable. Burning pits, fire chambers, molten metal for pouring down throats, spiked walls and ceilings for impaling, rotating blades for chopping off body parts, and iron hooks for hanging were all said to be found within the walls of this palace that's given the name Ashoka's Hell. No one who enters the palace ever comes out alive. It did evidently have a beautiful garden in front of it, though. Now, at this point, you may be wondering, why are you even talking about this psychopath anyway? Well, it's because, believe it or not, he's often referred to today as Ashoka the Great, one of the greatest and most beloved rulers in the history of India. And his redemption arc begins in 262 BCE. Ashoka has dreams of surpassing his grandfather and father who had successfully grown the Mauryan Empire to encompass nearly the entire Indian subcontinent, modern-day Afghanistan and Bangladesh. For his first conquest, he sets his sights on the kingdom of Kalinga, an unconquered area located on the eastern coast of India that his grandfather had once tried to take but failed. The Kalinga were a proudly independent people who had wealth, trading ports and a well-trained military, and defeating them would be a great first step to show he'd surpassed his forefathers. So Ashoka takes an army of 600,000 infantry, 30,000 cavalry and 9,000 war elephants and attacks Kalinga with the entire might of the Mauryan Empire. The Kalinga, though heavily outnumbered, refused to surrender and fight bravely to the end in a desperate but ultimately failed attempt to defend their homeland. The war does not last long, but is literal hell on earth, and the death and destruction are at levels unseen until World War II. The Mauryans win the war, but at a heavy cost, and when Ashoka goes to the battlefield to bask in his greatness, he's instead horrified by what he sees. The bodies of over 100,000 dead Kalinga soldiers litter the ground. Every step he takes is into a pool of festering blood. The stench of rotting flesh is unbearable, and the swarm of flies feasting on the corpses is deafening. He sees women, young and old, searching for their husbands, their fathers, and their children amongst the rotting bodies. Some are unlucky enough to find their loved ones, and their howling cries burn Ashoka's ears. He was not the first nor the last ruler to be confronted by the harsh realities of war, but in this moment he's perhaps one of the few rulers in history who was filled with a deep sense of remorse. Was this the greatness he was seeking? Ashoka leaves the battlefield a changed man. He will no longer seek glory through war, and he invests himself wholly in the study of Buddhism. He begins to erect pillars throughout his kingdom with edicts on how he wishes for his people to live peacefully with respect for one another, no matter their cultural or religious background. For the rest of his reign, he goes on no further conquests. His only goal was peace and the betterment of the lives of everyone living within his empire. He begins to use the empire's treasury to erect shelters for travelers, plant fruit-bearing trees along the main roads to feed the needy, and digs irrigation systems to provide clean water for everyone. Through his efforts, Maurya grows prosperous and enjoys peace that lasts for decades. He funds Buddhist missions out of India in an attempt to foster world peace, and his effort spreads the philosophy throughout Asia. When India regained its independence from British rule in 1947, Ashoka's chakra was chosen as the central icon of the country's flag. It's 600 BCE, and a king named Astyages is lying awake in bed, troubled by a strange dream. In his vision, he saw an ocean of water flowing from his daughter that swept through not only his kingdom of Media, but flooded all of Asia as well. The next morning, he's still troubled by this dream, and he seeks counsel from his magi, whose interpretation chills him to the bone. The dream was an omen that the offspring of his daughter would one day challenge him for the rule of his empire. To prevent this, he quickly marries her off to a mild-mannered Persian king named Cambyses the First. Ain't no way any great conqueror is going to come from Persia. But just a year after the marriage, Astyages has another dream. This time his daughter stands before him, and vines suddenly begin to grow from her back. The vines grow so large that they entangle all of Asia. Astyages is again freaked out, and again he goes to see his magi, who confirms his worst fears. The son of his daughter will dethrone him and go on to rule an empire that stretches to the four corners of the world. The words of his magi scare the crap out of Astyages, and he decides then and there that he'll do everything he can to ensure this prophecy never comes true. But before he can even think of a plan, his daughter becomes pregnant and gives birth to a boy. Astyages orders his most trusted general, a man named Harpagus, to immediately travel to Persia and kill the child. Loyal to his king, the general makes the journey, rips the infant from the hands of its mother, and walks away as she begs for him to stop. Harpagus carries the baby out of the city, but as he looks down at the newborn, he finds he just doesn't have it in him to take the life of an infant. So instead, he gives the baby to a shepherd and tells him to go leave it in the woods to die. As ordered, the shepherd takes the baby and carries it off into the woods. But unknown to Harpagus, The wife of the shepherd had just given birth to a stillborn child. As he walks into the woods, he stares into the eyes of the infant, and he can't help but to think of his own child and what could have been. The shepherd decides to disobey Harpagus and brings the baby home, and he and his wife decide to secretly raise him as their own. They name the boy Agradates, and the shepherd buries their own stillborn son and gives Harpagus the location of the body. As far as everyone else knows, the matter is settled. The royal infant is dead. So Agradates is raised in the countryside, away from the royal family, completely unaware of his lineage, and he grows into a strong, charismatic boy. One day at the age of 10, he's playing with some other kids, and in their game, he gets named the king. As king, he orders around the other boys, and they all play along, except this one kid who was the son of a Median noble. When the kid refuses to listen, Agradates orders the other boys to rough him up, to teach him a lesson for not listening to their king. The noble boy goes home crying and tells on Agradates, and the boy's dad can't stand the injustice, and he immediately goes to Astyages to complain to get this shepherd boy punished. Agradates and his shepherd father are brought to the throne room in Media, and at first look Astyages is immediately suspicious. This boy looks exactly like him and is the same age his dead grandson would be, and on top of all this, he speaks and conducts himself with class far above a commoner. He turns to the shepherd and demands the truth. Who is this boy? The shepherd defends that this is his son until Astyages threatens him with severe punishment if he's lying, at which point he reveals everything. The king is furious, not so much at the shepherd, but at his most trusted general who had failed him. Harpagus is summoned to the throne room, and as he enters, he sees the shepherd and the boy, and immediately knows he's fed. Harpagus knows there's no use in lying, so he tells the truth. But surprisingly, the king seems to keep his cool. He tells Harpagus that he had often felt bad about, killing his grandson, and he's actually somewhat relieved that he's still alive. Tell you what, let's celebrate his return tonight. Come back later and, could you please send your 13-year-old son a little earlier so my grandson will have a companion? Harpagus is relieved and goes home and tells his wife and kid what's going on. He sends his son to the palace early, not thinking anything of it, and starts to get freshened up for the feast. When his son arrives at the palace, Astyages orders his soldiers to kill him and chop him into pieces. Some parts of the boy are then roasted and other parts are boiled. These cooked pieces of human flesh were then placed on silver platters for later in the evening. At the royal feast, Harpagus is seated with other nobles and mutton is served to everyone. Harpagus's mutton looks a little different, but the king seems to be in a good mood, so they all eat up. Once everyone's stuffed, Astyages asks Harpagus for a little help. He calls for his attendants, who bring in a basket and places it directly in front of Harpagus. He orders him to lift the basket. Hesitantly, he follows the king's commands and is horrified to see the head and hands of his son. Astyages, with an evil grin, then asks Harpagus if he enjoyed his meal. A little gamey, perhaps? Harpagus comes to the sickening realization that he had just eaten his own son for dinner. Against all odds, he maintains his composure and simply states, "Whatever my king does pleases me." He asks to keep the remains of his son, which he calmly takes and buries at home. But secretly, he never forgives the king and will spend the rest of his life plotting his revenge. Feeling pretty proud about the way he dealt with that not-so-bright Harpagus, Astyages now has to figure out what to do with this grandchild he had feared. I mean, he could just kill him and get it over with, but instead he seeks the counsel of his magi again, who tell him that technically the prophecy had come true. The boy had become a king in the game he was playing, so now he doesn't pose any threat. Relieved, Astyages apologizes to the boy and sends him to be raised in Persia by his biological parents, who are both confused but also happy that their son they thought was dead for 10 years is somehow still alive. They rename him Cyrus II after his Persian grandfather. Well, in Persia, Cyrus grows to be a strong and capable leader, and when Cambyses passes away, he assumes the throne and begins setting his sights on larger conquests. He soon realizes that the greatness he desires will be impossible if he's still under the thumb of his grandfather, and he begins plotting ways to regain Persia's independence. Back in Media, Harpagus gets wind that Cyrus may have higher ambitions, and he sends him a secret message. In his letter, he reminds Cyrus of how his grandfather wanted him killed, and that if Persia were to lead a rebellion against Media, he would turn his forces against Astyages and fight alongside him. This sounds like a pretty good deal, but Cyrus has one last problem. Persia is less of a kingdom and more of a scattering of tribes that kind of tolerate a ruler. If he wants to have any success against his grandfather, he first needs to unite these tribes to fight as a unified army. As the new ruler of Persia, he orders men from across his lands to a forest and orders them to clear it within a day. Not knowing what kind of ruler Cyrus is going to be, the men begrudgingly do so, and by the end of the day are completely exhausted. The next day, Cyrus again calls them back to the same spot. The aching men head back to the forest, thinking this Cyrus guy might need to be taken care of quickly if he keeps this up. But when they arrive, they're shocked to find Cyrus with an incredible feast laid out in the clearing. He invites them to eat, and instead of working, the men spend the whole day relaxing, drinking, and eating the most delicious food they've ever tasted. As the sun begins to set, Cyrus stands before them and says, "Persians, you have the power to shape your own future. If you follow me, you will enjoy days like today and even better ones without having to endure hard labor. But if you go against my plans, you will face hardships worse than what you experienced yesterday. I speak to you as a voice of freedom. It seems that Providence has chosen me to bring prosperity to you. You are just as capable and brave as the Medes." Knowing this, refused to continue obeying Astyages. The men erupt into cheers. Finally, a true leader has come to save them from the tyranny of the Median Empire. With full support of all the clans in Persia, Cyrus quickly raises an army and leads an all-out assault against his grandfather's forces. Astyages orders Harpagus to command his army to defend his lands and stop this revolt. But when the two armies meet on the battlefield, Harpagus does as he promised, turns his men and begins attacking the remaining Median soldiers. His revenge against Astyages has begun. Cyrus, with the help of Harpagus, goes on to dethrone his grandfather and establishes what will be known as the Achaemenid Empire. Exactly as Astyages saw in his dreams, this new empire quickly grows, and at its peak stretches from the Mediterranean to the Indus River, the largest empire the world had ever seen to this point. And unlike his grandfather, Cyrus rules with fairness and equality. He is loved by everyone in his land throughout his reign and long after he dies, so much so that he even snags an honorable mention in the Bible for being a cool guy.